Hi, everybody. Today is Monday, July 28th, 2025, and Colonel Jacques Baud is back with us after a week. He wanted some sort of day off, and he's back. He's back. Thank you so much, Colonel, for being with us.
Exactly. Thank you very much for inviting me and happy to be back with you. Thank you.
Let's start, Colonel, with what's going on with the case of Gaza. We had Steve Witkoff going there talking with Hamas. He couldn't achieve any sort of agreement. And in the United States, Donald Trump is talking about finishing the job. And here is what Lindsey Graham said on Fox News on the latest attitude on the part of the Trump administration and these people who are supporting Israel.
Said he told Prime Minister Netanyahu to, quote, finish the job this week. I know that you are in touch with President Trump. You're in touch with Israeli officials. What are you anticipating is going to happen next? What does finish the job mean, Senator?
Well, I talked to Cindy McCain last night. Here's some good news for the people in Gaza. Humanitarian quarters are now going to be open. Israel's going to work with the UN, the World Food Program, to get some food into these people who need it. But I think what the topic we're talking about today is a change in strategy. I think President Trump has come to believe, and I certainly have come to believe, there's no way you're going to negotiate an end to this war with Hamas. Hamas is a terrorist organization who is chartered to destroy the state of Israel. They're religious Nazis. They hold Israeli hostages. I think Israel's come to conclude that they can't achieve a goal of ending the war with Hamas that would be satisfactory to the safety of Israel. And if they're going to do in Gaza what we did in Tokyo and Berlin, take the place by force, then start over again, presenting a better future for the Palestinians, hopefully having the Arabs take over the West Bank and Gaza. But I think going forward, Christian, you're going to see a change in tactics, a full military effort by Israel to take Gaza down like we did in Tokyo and Berlin.
Senator.
Yeah. Colonel, when you see the way that Europeans are talking about Gaza and the position of the Trump administration, what's your take on the latest activities on both part, on the part of Europeans and the United States?
Well, in fact, we are back to square one because the essential problem, when we talk about Gaza, with Europeans or the US, especially with Lindsey Graham now, they automatically link the problem to Hamas. And I think this is a kind of obsession that you have in the West, which is explained, or you can explain that by the fact that we tend to be trapped by the word terrorist. The word terrorist or terrorism, especially in the US, has been used and abused, I could say, to define, I mean, it has become not a technical term, but a political term. It defines people you don't want to talk to. So Iran is a terrorist state, and Russia is a terrorist state, and so when you don't want to talk to someone, you just say he's a terrorist, and then everything is said. Then you are allowed to do everything. You're allowed to cut economic ties, political, diplomatic ties, everything. The problem is that terrorism, and even if there is no agreed international definition of that, it is an activity. It's a method. It's a combat method. It's not an ideology. It's a way of doing things. And we tend to forget that, and we tend to apply the word to anybody. But if you examine, and I tried to review the activities of Hamas, especially when I was doing this book, the Al-Aqsa Flood, I studied, and it's not the first time, because I wrote already a book in 2003 on asymmetric warfare. and which is essentially based on the situation in the West Bank and the situation with the Hamas at the time. And even at that time, I had a very hard time to define exactly who and why Hamas is terrorist. I mean, it's certainly a resistance movement. That's something it cannot be denied. But you have different methods to resist. You can have peaceful resistance, civil resistance. You may have different way of resisting. Terrorism might be one. But I don't see, especially since 2005, since Hamas took over in the Gaza Strip, it's very hard to find evidence or example of terrorist act of Hamas. You can probably have those examples in the late 80s, early 90s, when Hamas was created and was defining itself. But since the early 2000s, when the Hamas decided to become a political movement and started to take part into local elections and then the parliamentary election in 2005, you can see a radical change in the doctrine. And that's, by the way, that's from this time that they started to elaborate a new charter, which eventually was published in 2017, that is radically different from the one they had in 1987. And if you look at the activities of Hamas since 2000, probably 3 or 4, when they started to be part of the local election, it's very hard to define a terrorist activity. And there is actually none. And that's one thing. Now, they resist, and they resist using weapons. But I remind you that this is a right that has been defined explicitly by the UN General Assembly. And you have several resolutions that acknowledge, A, the right of the Palestinians to resist the Israeli occupation, point one, and the right to resist by force, by using arms. And this right is explicit in the international law for the Palestinians, specifically for the Palestinians. Therefore, when we see the way the Israelis have handled the Gaza Strip from since 2005, even before, but before you had settlers, and it was slightly different, but especially after 2005, and how you see the way the Israelis handle the West Bank, where you don't have a majority. I mean, you have a presence of Hamas now, but it's not essentially the area, the main area of the Hamas. In any case, when you see the way the Israelis handle the West Bank, you can see that this kind of ruthless application of the Israeli military practices in the West Bank, it's not related to terrorism. It's related to the pushing or pressing a population into submission and even eradication or extermination. So that's something that has been acknowledged, by the way, by the international law. So the fact that we always stick to the word terrorist, and beyond that, using the word terrorist as a pretext for not negotiating, I think is the wrong approach that we have in the West. We should consider, and I speak I speak from personal knowledge, because part of my family was in the French resistance during World War II. And one of my uncles, who used to be in French resistance in the south of France, was considered as terrorists by the Germans. So we are exactly in the same situation. And I would say that probably my uncle was even more ruthless than the Hamas is. I can say that. So this idea of sticking and using the word terrorist as a pretext for not negotiating is, to my mind, first a mistake. And by the way, if we are honest, if we look at what Israel is doing by targeting deliberately civilians, by using inappropriate weapons that are mass destruction weapons, like heavy bombs and things like this, but also targeting individuals as they wait for food, like children, women, and all that. This equals terrorism. This is a clear example, and we don't have any example of similar behavior from the Hamas. If I would compare the use of word terrorism, if we apply it to Hamas or if we apply it to, there is no comparison. Israel is a terrorist state with no discussion. And I think this is something that everybody acknowledges today. While the Hamas, we use the word, but nobody, and I never heard anybody able to provide any example of that. The problem is that we still use the word, as I said, as a pretext for not negotiating. And the conditions and what we have witnessed, to come back to your question, what we have seen in the recent weeks, this idea that Hamas should lay down their weapons doesn't make any sense. This idea of resistance, as I said, is embedded in international law. Therefore, even if we may have a situation where Hamas decide, okay, we drop weapons, and then they change name and they become another organization, because the Palestinian resistance will not stop until we continue to be armed, because it is entitled to do so. While Israel has absolutely no right whatsoever to occupy the Palestinian territory. And the Palestinian territory includes the Gaza Strip and the totality of the West Bank, as it was said in July last year by the UN General Assembly. And Israel has absolutely not the right to occupy a single square meter of that. So the organization, which is in the total illegality in the whole process, is Israel. And I'm not even mentioning the fact that the whole territory of Israel has been acquired against international law. In contravention to the international law. I remind you that the resolution 181 of November 1947 asked for a referendum or referendums in order to establish a 2 or 1 state solution. And in order to avoid this, the Israeli militias, they were not Israeli at that time, they were Jews because Israel didn't exist. The Jewish militias decided to take the territory by force instead of complying with the resolution, UN resolution, which, as I said, asked for referendums. So the whole territory of Israel is illegal in essence. Today is tolerated. Even the borders of Israel are not even legal. In fact, they don't exist, to be honest, because Israel refused to define them. And therefore, the territory of Israel, as we know it on the map, is in fact tolerated It's not even legally established. And in addition to that, all the territories that are occupied by Israel in South Lebanon, in Syria, and in the West Bank and Gaza, those territories should be vacated from any Israeli, both civilian and military. Therefore, when you have a negotiation, when we ask always the Palestinian to stop resisting, although they are entitled to, and they're even entitled to use weapons for that, there is something wrong in that. And therefore, how can you have any prospect of success if you engage in negotiation that in fact contradict international law? Because exactly what you just said about Steve Witkoff and all the dialogue that has started, at least that we can say, under the Trump administration, it has always considered that the Palestinians should not be there. The reality is exactly the opposite. And therefore, we have to be, we will not achieve any kind of success if we don't accept the reality of the international law and the reality of international justice. By denying that to the Palestinians, we will not achieve anything. And the Israelis are not right there since 1947, not just since now, since October 2023, in fact. And if the Palestinians want to have a compromise, and I think they have indicated many times that they're ready for a compromise, but then that means that the first step to achieve any kind of negotiation is first to have Israel to comply with international law. And I don't understand why Lindsey Graham is an extremist. And when he used the word a religious Nazi, I think probably he talks about himself, because he corresponds to that definition. The Hamas has nothing to do with religious extremism. In fact, that's why, by the way, Israel is funding Islamist militias within the Gaza Strip to fight Hamas. And in fact, these are militias that were linked to the Islamic State. So Israel is funding these guys, and the Islamic State has always been adverse to Hamas, because the Hamas precisely is not related to that. And there is also a kind of misunderstanding we have in the in the media and even among politicians, that Hamas is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, and therefore it is the Muslim Brotherhood. This is totally wrong. It's exactly the opposite. I mean, the Hamas broke from the Muslim Brotherhood. That's exactly what happened. And in fact, if you look at the history of the Muslim Brotherhood in the region, which is an organization that you find mostly in the Mashrek area, that means the eastern part of the Mediterranean, you have, or you had, better said, the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria, the Muslim Brotherhood in Turkey, the Muslim Brotherhood in Jordan. You never had a Muslim Brotherhood in Palestine. This was a breakaway because precisely they didn't agree on the fundamentals. And Sheikh Yassin, who created the Hamas movement, broke away from the Muslim Brotherhood, of which he was a member, by the way, as Yasser Arafat, by the way. But they broke away because they didn't agree with the fundamentals of the Muslim Brotherhood. And therefore, it's trying to make an analogy between the Islamic State and Hamas and all that, and putting that in a kind of a melting pot of groupings that we tend to call terrorists is a way to show and to portray the Palestinians as terrorists. And Palestinians did use terrorism. I mean, when I was young, I remember, but then it was even before the Hamas, by the way. And Yasser Arafat, I remember when you had regularly airliners hijacked by the Palestinians, but they were mostly, by the way, Marxist terrorism at that time.
It was 1970s, 1980s.
Yes, that was the 70s until, I mean, I would say from the late 60s up to the and then you have of course a change, because as from 1974, Yasser Arafat decided the PLO would renounce to the use of terrorism, but you had other groups that used to be part of PLO that broke away from the PLO and continued to make some terrorism, like the Abu Nidal movement and all that, and that continued up to the early 80s. And in the 60s, I mean, you had the famous Tricontinental Conference in the Habana in Cuba, where all the Marxist revolutionary movement decided to fight a common struggle. And therefore, you had Palestinians fighting for not just for the Palestinians, but also for the progressive forces, and that's the reason why they were cooperating with some terrorist movement in Europe, or with the Irish IRA, or movement related to the IRA in Ireland, and things like that. So you had all this connection. It was really, at that time, you had an incredible network of terrorist movement that was essentially Marxist, that was managed from far away, but with some advisors, by the way, from the Soviet Union, from the East German Secret Service, from the Czech or Czechoslovakia, at the time it was Czechoslovakia, Secret Service, and you had a lot of Palestinian fighters trained with the Czechoslovakian parachutists, for instance, or airborne troops in Olomouc, for instance, in the famous basis of Olomouc. And myself, when I was at that time, and in the early 80s, when I was in intelligence, and I was sent to South Africa and to see the operation in South Angola, and with the SWAPO. I remember having even met guerrilla fighters of the SWAPO, the Southwest Africa Popular Organization. And they told me they had been trained with the special forces in Czechoslovakia in particular. So you had really, at that time, you had a network of organization, and that went well beyond, I mean, that was definitely not based on religion. It was something that was definitely related to some kind of Marxist project. In any case, this organization or this network broke completely away in the late 80s as the communist bloc disappeared, basically, and all the support disappeared also, and all these groups. And that's very true if you look at the the various movements that were operating, for instance, in Colombia, in South America, then they started to shift and to go from the armed struggle into political struggle. And you had many movements that became political parties instead of political armies. And you had that in Bolivia, you had that in many countries. But that was the result of the collapse of the communist bloc. And in Palestine, what you had is that with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the collapse of the Soviet support to all the neighboring countries, that includes Syria and all that, the Palestinians had to find other, let's say, I would say, other ideological basis for the fight, a kind of a doctrine. But if you look at Hamas, for instance, it's not fighting for religion, and that's people like Lindsey Graham. These people are totally uneducated, and of course probably illiterate to some extent because they don't understand things. They put everything in the same pack, and everything is terrorists. And in reality, the Hamas has tried to find a common ground for uniting people. You know, in the Marxist ideology, it's a class struggle. Let's put it very simply. You have the workers' class against the imperialist class and things like this. But you try to find a common ground for the fighters, and then you have the political fight. And for the Palestinians, was the same thing. The thing is that in order to find the common ground, they found Islam as the common ground because that provides the ideology. The ideology not, to fight for the religion, but to fight with the religion. And that's very important to understand. That explains why, for instance, you had the former Palestinian terrorist movement, what you had in the 60s, 70s, they used to hijack airplanes in order to have the release of prisoners in some country. You see? You never see that with Islamists or people who are based on or have a struggle based on religion. Because when you base your fight on religion, then you have other principles. You're not trying to fight. I mean, to some extent, the Palestinians, under the Marxist terrorists, I would say terrorist ideology, were fighting a little bit according to Western standard. That means that you try to keep all your fighters, and they used to fight a little bit as did the resistance in many countries during World War II. And so you take hostages in order to to have the release of some prisoners and things like this. With Islam, it's not the same. On the contrary, everybody is responsible for himself because he's just responsible not towards the movement, but towards God. And that's the reason why you have people who are ready to die for something, which you don't have with secular movements. People in the secular movement, as you have in our armies, and people are not ready to die. I mean, they may fight up to the death, but they are not especially keen to die. I'm not saying that the Islamist fighters are keen to die, but they accept death much better because it shows a kind of an achievement somehow. And this provide a kind of a doctrinal basis for your resistance movement. And then the resistance, and that's the reason why you have a fundamental ideological struggle between, or not struggle, but opposition between Hamas and the Islamic State, let's say. Because Islamic State is fighting for having precisely an Islamic State, while the Hamas is just fighting to have a state. Okay? The Hamas is not fighting for religion, it's fighting for territory. And if you read what the Islamic State used to write. I mean, I'm talking about something like 8 years ago or so, because now the Islamic State has almost disappeared, I mean, formally. But when you had an Islamic State in the south of Syria, you had a lot of writings done, a lot of propaganda written and all that. And if you read those documents, you will see that the Islamic State was heavily criticizing the Hamas, precisely because they were not fighting for God, but they were fighting for a territory. Now, when you have people like Lindsey Graham trying to create a confusion with that, it has the only purpose of prohibiting or denying any prospect for negotiation. And that's why the politicians, but politicians, the problem with politicians is that very often they don't have the time or the curiosity or the interest or the intellectual capacity, which is something we should not discard. They don't have the intellectual capacity to understand the problems they are dealing with. And that's exactly what we have with Lindsey Graham. You see, this guy is just driven by hate. He hates the Chinese, he hates the Russians, he hates everybody, everything that is not American. And therefore, he should. These guys are not. These guys are, according to me, a punishment for the Americans, not a solution. But that's that's about the American to deal with that. In any case, what we have seen in the recent months, as it comes to negotiation, we tried always to avoid any, let's say, constructive discussions with the resistance, although they have demonstrated their willingness and their determination to have a constructive solution. They are already not, I mean, they don't, a resistance exists because there is an occupation. If you don't have any occupation, you don't have a resistance. I mean, even not mathematically, but physically, if you don't have something against you, then you don't have a resistance. It's just physically so. And Israel has not understood that, because Israel is a country that understands only the rule of force. And not even the rule of force, the rule of violence, which is slightly different. Because force is where you have you have a control over the use of force. Israel used violence. It's beyond force. It used hate. And that's exactly what we have seen in the video shown by the Israeli soldiers, by the way, their way of firing at kids just for the fun, for instance. This is beyond use of force. This is the use of violence. And that's, in essence, and I'm a former military, so the reason, the rationale for having an army is to stay within the use of force and not the use of violence. When you get rogue, then you tend to go to violence. And this is something, when I was in the UN, I was in charge of the doctrine of peacekeeping operations. And I spent a lot of time on the issue of the protection of civilians. And I made a lot of studies in the cases where you have violence against civilians. And in most cases, you see that you start to have violence, I mean, not longer the use of force, but use of violence when soldiers are not commanded anymore, where the command has collapsed and you have soldiers on the loose. And in that situation, they tend to be violent. The rationale for the command and control of an armored force is precisely to use force with specific objectives for specific purpose, not to disperse your forces, not to try to disperse your or to engage into hate, for instance, because then you start to do things that are not consistent with a strategy. It starts to be just violence for violence. That's exactly what we have seen in the Gaza Strip. And that's the reason why the Israelis are losing, by the way. They make a lot of casualties, that's for sure. But at the same time, by letting the soldiers just go into violence, they don't have any control of any kind of strategy. And if you look at the way the Israeli fight in the Gaza Strip, you can see there is no real strategy. They just send their soldiers like mad dogs, and they start to attack anybody, everybody, without a focus, without a targeting, a targeted operational focus. As a result, they make a lot of death, the casualties. They kill a lot of people. They make a lot of atrocities, but they don't achieve any success. And I have written a lot of articles on that, by the way, because this is something which is very much misunderstood. The dynamics that you have and the purpose of command and control in an armored force. When you start to remove the command, then you have just mad dogs, and you have to fight against mad dogs. That's exactly what we have in Israel. But the problem in Israel is that it's not because they lose the command. It's the command which is that way. It's a concept. And that's something that you would find in, I hope, in no other Western and civilized country and army, because then you start to you will emphasize the keeping the command and control over your troops. Otherwise, you are dispersing your resources. But the Israelis are not. This is embedded into the culture, I would say, that you just kill people. And that makes the Israeli, on the one hand, extremely inefficient, effective but inefficient. That means that they kill a lot of people, but they don't achieve the objective. But they're effective in killing people. And this is something that requires, in my view, much more thinking. And the problem with people like Lindsey Graham, by oversimplifying the problem, they tend to avoid any solution. And the problem with that is, if we don't have any solution, that means that the situation will, in fact, degrade and worsen for both. But I think the determination of the Palestinians is stronger than the Israelis. And we have seen that, by the way, after the so-called 12 days war, that the Israelis are much more vulnerable than the others. They don't have the determination. They are driven by hate, not by determination. Palestinians are driven not by hate, by determination. It's exactly the opposite. That's why the Palestinians are able to they manage to keep their resistance movement quite alive after 80 years, while the Israelis are not even able to sustain 12 days struggle. I mean, they start crying very, very soon. And since the 7th of October 2023, we haven't seen the Palestinians crying. You see? So that's what we see is a structural and intellectual weakness of the Israelis, which is, if we go deeper, which is based on a legitimacy weakness, because the more we go into, and what the merit, if I can say that way, the merit of the 7th of October 2023 is that he opened our eyes on the legitimacy of Israel. And a lot of people started to think about how Israel came about and everything that surround the creation of Israel. And it was highlighted, and I did exactly the same process, by the way, because that's a result of my book here behind me, because we had to study and try to understand what is wrong, who has some kind of legitimacy and all that. And we see that Israel has not much legitimacy, and they understand that now. And a lot of Israelis, not Israelis, Jews around the world understand that too. And I think, surprisingly, the only ones who haven't understood the opportunity are the Arab neighboring countries. I think they haven't seized that the opportunity of that situation. But if we look at everything that happened in the last the last 2 years, or a year and a half or so, we can say that it has opened the eyes of the international community on the very fragile legitimacy of Israel, and the very fragile also principles on which Israel is based. I mean, today nobody tries to use the word democracy of the Middle East, the only democracy of the Middle East. It's not a democracy. It has never been. And B, it's not even a state ruled by law, because it adjusts law as it suits them. So and there is not the same law for everybody. Therefore, we see that it's a country that is totally and somehow is something which is, that's why it has also so many resolutions against him and all that, because it's a country that stands out of the international community, not because he's Jew, but because it misbehaves.
Yeah.
And that's very important to say, because as soon as you criticize, you say, oh, well, you're anti-Semitic. And so, no, it's not that. I'm not judging the fact that you are Jew or not. I'm judging the fact that you behave or misbehave. And if you misbehave, I judge the misbehavior. And the misbehavior is beyond any rule, any humanity, any human sense that you may have. I mean, we expected after 1945 that the atrocities of World War II would not happen again. And we see that they not even happen again, but they are even worse.
Yeah.
They are worse today than they used to be in World War II. Definitely. And that's something we have, we can easily demonstrate. So, and therefore, Israel stands out of the international community. And that's something which is extremely worrying, if you want to, if you look from outside. On the other hand, it's not the way they want to be, so be it. But that means that they might be definitely considered as out of the international community.
They don't care about you, and they don't care about.
Well, because they are protected. And again, because you have people like Lindsey Graham who protect them, who provide this kind of a US umbrella. That's the reason why they don't need to make any effort to integrate into the even regional community. And when you talk about the Israeli diplomacy, I mean, it's inexistent, essentially. It used, I mean, Israel had an effective diplomacy up to the early 70s. And you had a great Minister of Foreign Affairs. Again, I'm not saying they did everything right or so, but at least they had a diplomacy like Abba Eban and so on, who used to be real diplomats and tried to establish the positioning of Israel into the international community. But I said up to the early 70s. And look in time, that's the time in which the US started to protect Israel, the early 70s. Before that, the US was much more cautious about Israel. And that was definitely the case with the Kennedy administration. I mean, up to the Kennedy administration. I mean, people were very, very cautious. And if you hear the General de Gaulle, for instance, in France, who used to say that the Israelis are a small, arrogant people who are, there's a famous press conference. I don't remember exactly the time. It was probably 1962 or something like that. I may be wrong on the date, but there's a famous speech he made about Israel, which you don't hear anymore because it is, I mean, it is a description of Israel as nobody would dare to say today. But he said that was an arrogant, aggressive, extremely, very capable, but at the same time extremely arrogant and aggressive population that will try to impose its will over its neighbors. And remember something I have mentioned already. This is just before the vote of the resolution 181 that I mentioned before in November 1947. Just a month before, in the 5th of October 1947, the CIA produced a note for President Truman in order to prevent, I mean, to discourage the US government to accept the resolution 181. And in that document, which you will find in my book, by the way, it's I put an extract of this note of the CIA.
Al-Aqsa flood. You're talking about Al-Aqsa flood.
Al-Aqsa flood, correct. I have this book here.
Yeah.
Al-Aqsa flood here, this one.
Yeah.
And in that book, I explained that the CIA said, don't accept this proposition, this resolution, because if you accept that, the Zionists will never be satisfied with the result of the resolution. They will try to expand their power by military force. They will provoke terrorist act, and then they will blame the Arabs for that. This is said explicitly. This is if you take this assessment of the CIA in 1947, you could change the date after 80 years. It's basically, you just need to change a date, but the content is absolutely valid for today. And meaning that up to the early 70s, the West was not so keen to protect Israel. And therefore, Israel had to make some effort to interact with regionally and internationally. Since the early 70s, when the US started to protect actively Israel felt that they didn't feel the necessity of having an active diplomacy. And since then, you can hardly mention any diplomatic initiative from Israel. I mean, the all the Oslo Accords and things like this, the Oslo process, these were initiatives driven by the US, not by the Israelis. You see, they never had this willingness to live in peace with the Palestinians. In fact, the whole history of Israel was a sequence of attacks against Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, Egypt. They attacked everybody, and including the Palestinians, of course. But they never felt the need of being at peace with others. And every single peace agreement you had with Israel were in fact promoted by the US, not by Israel. That's very interesting to see. This is a fundamental understanding of security policy or national security policy. Again, I explained that on your channel, that in my country, Switzerland, we tend to have a security policy based on cooperation. While in Israel, they have a security policy based on confrontation. This is a fundamental approach to the national security. The problem is that it was okay when the Middle East was considered as enemy by the West, and therefore Israel was considered as the advanced position, the advanced strong point of the West in the Middle East. But today this is the opposite. Today, countries like Saudi Arabia, even Syria today, are considered the allies of the West, meaning that the interest for Israel has decreased because the West is present with much more interesting partners, such as Saudi Arabia, the Emirates in the Persian Gulf.
Yeah.
I mean, these are...
Qatar,
Sorry?
Qatar, it's so...
Qatar, exactly. Yes, all these countries are much more interesting for the West than Israel. Israel just receives money and produce little, while the others have money to invest in our countries. Therefore, so the balance of force has shifted in this area, and Israel has not realized that yet. And of course, you have other issues such as the personal situation of Netanyahu, and he makes attempt to negotiate when it suits him because it's okay with the legal process in which he is involved in, and therefore he adjusts the policy to his own personal situation, which is somehow he has personalized the war against Palestinians because it suits him personally. But beyond that, you see that Israel has not managed to find a balance, I would say, a political balance. It is still with the same problems it has always had. That means that it needs the very small extremist party to achieve, to create governments. And therefore, it has today, these people are like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, who are necessary to Netanyahu. And therefore, this tends to make the government or the policies of the government more extremist than they should be. And I think at the end of the day, this is detrimental for Israel. But at the end, they should realize that by themselves, if they don't, this will probably lead to their ultimate failure. But yes, I mean, that's their problem.
Yeah.
The problem is that in the meantime, Palestinians pay the price for this. And that's something which is totally unacceptable. And the problem is that the international community accepts that. Because it's nice to say, Macron, we will recognize the state of Palestine and all that. Well, even if This is the 10th time he says so. So I don't have, I mean, I don't expect much from him. But in any case, we see that beyond words, no Western country is ready to act. When it comes to Russia, everybody, I mean, not everybody, but some countries are ready to send troops in Ukraine and send troops to protect Ukrainians. And so when it comes to Palestinians, nobody mentions even that. Even they can even agree on using, for instance, peace enforcement for the Palestinian. This would be a possibility. I mean, you have peacekeeping, where you once you have a peace agreement, then you maintain peace by having troops. That's what you have in Lebanon, for instance. And when you don't, you cannot reach an agreement, then you can have what the UN calls peace enforcement, mean that you send troops in order to bring the parties to the negotiation table, mean that you enforce a negotiation, a peace through negotiation. And that's something that would be legally feasible, but nobody wants to do it. And that shows how the Western politicians are coward, because we have all the legal instruments to do that. One important one is the decision of the International Court of Justice, who confirmed the fact that any Israeli presence on the Palestinian territory is illegal. Any Israeli in the West Bank, in Gaza, wherever, these people are illegally there. And the UN General Assembly in its resolution asks for the members of the United Nations to help Israel to enforce this resolution. And so far, I haven't seen any of the members of the UN to make the single move to enforce this resolution. Only the Houthis, they're probably the only ones who are willing to do something. But let's see. So that's where we are.
Yeah. Colonel, with the case of the EU, European Union, how can we understand their behavior? You talk about Switzerland. They somehow, in the process of the war in Ukraine, they have lost their status as being neutral, as being a country to negotiate, to be a common ground to everybody, to bring everybody in to negotiate, to talk. And we've learned from Austria, they're gonna side with other European countries. They're talking about not being neutral anymore, even with the case of Ukraine. Where are we going with the European Union? Are we gonna go to a European Union that is going to increase its strategy considering military operations? Or because the way that they're buying weapons, they're trying to say that they want to buy weapons, more weapons from the United States. The United States, Donald Trump is so happy that he's selling these weapons to Europeans. Nobody knows when they're gonna get there and when they're gonna produce these weapons, but they're gonna receive the money from Europe. Poor Europe, I would say. And why is Europe is so much in, I would say it's so much involved in the process of hating Russia that they want to commit suicide? What's going on with Europe today?
Well, it's a good question, because we are probably talking about something that goes beyond politics or geopolitics and goes into psychiatry. We have psychiatric cases with Ursula von der Leyen, Kaya Kallas, and all that. We see that, and we see that also to another extent with Keir Starmer, Emmanuel Macron. These people, I mean, all these people are in charge of entities. I mean, for Ursula von der Leyen, this is obviously the European Commission, and this is the executive part of the European Union. Keir Starmer with the UK, France, and Emmanuel Macron with France, and Friedrich Merz with Germany. And all these entities have very important problems inside. I mean, budgetary, fiscal problems, social problems, everything. But they keep focusing on the situation in Ukraine. And when you listen to Kaya Kallas, who is the foreign ministry of I mean, this is the head of the External Action Service of the European Union, which is de facto some kind of foreign ministry of the European Union. I mean, when you have the problem with Iran, with China, with Israel, she's totally silent or incapable of issuing any kind of intelligent comment on that. Everything she does is related to Russia, because she comes from Estonia, which is a tiny country in Europe, and Estonia has been historically pro-Nazi during World War II, by the way, and that's the reason why, by the way, Soviet Union occupied this country even after the World War II. As the other Baltic states, they were all pro-Nazi during World War II, including the father or the grandfather, better said, of Kaya Kallas. So you had this sense that Soviet Union and today Russia are their worst enemy, and there is nothing else to talk about than Russia. And although Kaya Kallas represents, as I said, foreign ministry of about 30 countries, and with a lot of problems with relations, economic ties, and trade relationship with the rest of the world. No, her focus is Russia. Period. Russia. So that's why I'm saying we are in something which is more psychiatric than we are beyond rationale here. The fact of the matter is that since 2014, and more specifically since 2022, the focus of the European Union has not been to find a solution to the crisis, but to support Ukraine. And they didn't even try to support Ukraine diplomatically, try to find some kind of solution with Russia and all that. No, they provide weapons, and they funded the army and whatever, and today the economy to large extent. That means that the European Union, as for the case of Ukraine, but you could say with the case with Palestine, European Union has no strategy for that. They just try to support one actor, as they did for Israel. They support Israel, but there is no attempt to solve the problem. Try to use, when you are not directly involved in a conflict, and in theory that should be the case, that this is obviously a conflict between Ukraine and Russia. And regardless of how you feel about Russia or Ukraine, the fact is that being European, you are not directly involved in a conflict. And by not being directly involved in a conflict, you could adopt a posture of mediation and help to mediate in the conflict, even if you have a preference, although a good mediator doesn't have any preference. He mediates, so he's in the middle. But even if you have a preference, then you try to accommodate the two and try to, I mean, ideally this would have been done before February 2022, but the European Union didn't. Therefore, we went into a conflict situation in which the Europe was not prepared for and has no strategy whatsoever to address the problem. And that applies, I mean, you mentioned Switzerland, that applies to Switzerland the same. I mean, Switzerland, also we have to acknowledge, because of the pressure made by the European Union and the US, by the way, on the government of Switzerland, in order to have, because the idea in February 2022 was to isolate Russia completely from the rest of the world, completely. The idea was to have no line of communication with Russia. And that's why, by the way, the European Union still struggles to have China condemning Russia and all that. As of today, it doesn't make any sense, but they continue to have that. Because the idea that the West had in February 2022 was this brutal and very stiff isolation of Russia would bring the collapse of the government in Russia, and therefore the collapse of Russia. That was the idea. That's why you had all these sanctions taken all at the same time, brutally by everybody, without any concession. All the condemnation from in the UN General Assembly and all that, and the US made every effort to have kind of a unanimity against Russia, because the purpose was to achieve this kind of collapse within weeks. But it didn't happen. And Switzerland, in my view, didn't understand the opportunity here, because instead of playing the neutrality card, it complied with what the EU and the US were asking for. That means a compliance with the sanctions. And as of today, Switzerland is, depending how you count, but it's the second or the third country that applies the more sanctions on Russia. The first one being the US, and then the second is, depending how you count, either the Switzerland or the United Kingdom. But that depends a little bit how you count. I remember the Washington Post made an article in October last year showing that Switzerland was the second most sanctioning country towards Russia. Which is quite odd, because Switzerland has no tradition in using sanctions as a way of foreign policy. On the contrary, Switzerland tried always to have kind of a mediatory position and stand in the middle and help to solve issues from both sides. But for that time, for that situation, Switzerland abandoned neutrality. And the Swiss ambassador to Ukraine, Claude Wild, used to be a friend of mine. And he was the Swiss ambassador up to early last year. And he said very officially that Switzerland was not neutral in this conflict. So it abandoned neutrality for this conflict, which is quite odd. And the problem here is that, and that shows also the lack of strategic vision, because the purpose or the utility of having a neutral country like Switzerland is that it provides kind of an escape door in the conflict. You see, today, the West, and especially European Union, is not prepared and not set to talk to Russia, and has no really the willingness to do it. The Americans have tried to do it, but they haven't found the right language with Russia. And therefore, the attempts of Steve Witkoff also that failed definitely with Keith Kellogg. And Steve Witkoff tried also, but Steve Witkoff is not a politician. He didn't understand what is at stake. He's an intelligent person, he's a businessman, but not a politician. And therefore, all the talks he had with Putin didn't lead to anywhere. And that's the reason why we are in the situation we are today. But so the Americans tried, but they haven't found they don't communicate really with the Russians. And that's where the usefulness of a neutral country that would help to bypass these barriers you have between the big actors, and that could provide, as I said, kind of an escape door to the crisis by providing a possibility of dialogue with both sides. That's why you had, for instance, Switzerland, as Switzerland still represents the U.S. interest in Iran and represent the Iranian interest in the U.S., for instance. It used to do so also for Cuba before Obama reestablished diplomatic relationship with Cuba. But so that's a purpose, not the purpose, but it's where a neutral country can be useful. The problem is that the current government in Switzerland didn't understand this opportunity. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Europe is a fanatical against Russia, very similar to Ursula von der Leyen and all that. So that means there is no chance to have here a broader understanding or a kind of a geopolitical vision of the situation. And that's the reason why Switzerland, in fact, has lost all its credibility, because today the Russians consider that Switzerland has failed as a neutral state, belongs to the Western camp, and therefore we have no channel of communication anymore with the West. While during the Cold War, for instance, Switzerland was a privileged way of communication between the Russians, the Soviets at the time, and the U.S. And I have been. I was born in Geneva, and we had several meetings between Reagan, Gorbachev, Clinton, and so on. So you had all those meetings that happened because Switzerland had this privileged area where both parties could speak freely to each other. And that was, by the way, the case just in 2021, when Joe Biden and Vladimir Putin met in Geneva in June 2021. And that was the last time could so, because then Switzerland definitely opted for a more Western aligned position. And today, it was a suggestion, by the way, that the Istanbul talks should take place in Geneva. I think that was a proposition from the Americans and so on. And that was refused by the Russians. Russians said, no, Switzerland is no neutral anymore. And therefore, they preferred to have the meeting in Istanbul rather than Geneva. So that explains that was a missed opportunity for Switzerland. And that was a missed opportunity for the West as well, because the West not having a strategy, because that's the big problem, that we don't know the West, the Europeans don't know what they want to achieve in Ukraine. Today, they try to make some kind of damage limitation, but that's all. They haven't defined exactly what they want to achieve in Ukraine. They just provide weapons, period. But they talk about kind of a strategic neutralization of Russia, which means nothing. There's this idea of functional defeat of Russia, meaning that Russia cannot move or is let's say cannot move freely in Ukraine. It's a very fuzzy concept that you have, but the bottom line is that we don't know what we want to achieve. As a result, when you don't know what you want to achieve, you cannot have a strategy to address this objective because you don't have an objective. And as a result, you are exactly the situation we are. Just try to maintain the status quo or provide weapons, hoping that this will try to help the Ukrainians. The problem is that, as I have already written in 2022, in my first book, Operation Z, it was clear that the policy or the strategy, or not strategy, but the behavior of the West was in fact just leading Ukraine towards a disaster. And we haven't really changed that. It is still heading towards a disaster. And everybody understands that we are heading towards a disaster, but nobody has any understanding of how to prevent that. So, and that shows how the West has become weak. But we have shifted from Palestine to Ukraine in the discussion we have today. But we can see exactly the same thing in Palestine. The same thing with Iran. The West doesn't know what it wants to achieve. And mainly, I think one of the biggest problem is that we have been trapped into a narrative. Iran is a rogue country, Palestinians are terrorists, and Russia is a rogue country as well. And therefore, we are trapped into that narrative because you don't talk to a rogue state, you don't talk to a terrorist, you don't talk to that. And that's where this kind of schematic understanding, this black-white understanding of the realities, create a barrier to any kind of solution. And we have seen that those who propose solutions for Palestinians, Iran, are in fact the Russians themselves, Chinese, Iran themselves, but all the initiatives come from them, not from the West. The West is trapped into its narrative and has no prospect. We know that one of the possible ways to solve the situation in Palestine is probably, again, there are different views on that, but let's say probably to have a dialogue on the issue of the two states. And the first step to have that is probably to recognize Palestine, which is, by the way, already recognized by the UN. So it shouldn't be something extraordinary to recognize the state of Palestine, because formally it has been already recognized by the UN. So, and that could be a starting point towards something. But nobody dares to antagonize Israel. And we have the same thing with Iran. Everybody knows that Iran is right as to the nuclear initiative. Everybody knows it. But nobody wants the risk to antagonize both Israel and the US. You see. For Russia, it's a little bit different, because here you have a lot of other aspects. And again, as I said before, we are more in the area of psychiatry than in the area of politics, because and that's interesting, because that's something I mentioned in one of my books. But it's very a coincidence that all these people who are in charge today of those countries or the politics in Europe have in fact are the grandchildren of people who were Nazi or anti-Soviet during World War II. So to some extent, I said in one of my book, this is the war of the grandchildren, because somehow they make the war that their grandfather didn't manage to win. And today they try. So there is probably something. I'm not. I mean, again, we are in the area of psychiatry, which is definitely not my area, and there are probably things to dig into that, because that would explain how this inability to even think about opening a dialogue is. This is something we haven't seen during the Cold War. Even during the Cold War, even after the incident we had. I mean, you had one of the U.S. liaison officer killed in East Germany, for instance, in the early 80s. That was Lieutenant Colonel Nicholson, if I'm not wrong. He was killed by some East German soldier, although he was in a diplomatic mission, by the way. You had the downing of the KL 007 in the Sakhalin, over Sakhalin Peninsula in 1983, if I'm not wrong, which was a significant incident between the Soviet Union, Japan, and the West at large, because it was a civilian airliner that was downed by a Soviet fighter. So that was a significant incident. But even though, although we had all these incidents, we always kept talking to each other. This never led to a break of the diplomatic relations. We always kept talking. There was condemnations, there were criticisms and all that. That was clear. But you still had a dialogue. You still had a negotiation. You had all these negotiations about the nuclear arsenal. I mean, the START negotiation, SALT negotiation, and all that. All these negotiations were in fact the expression of an existing dialogue, regardless of everything that could happen, and the antagonism and the support for terrorism that the Soviet Union did in many parts of the world, or the support to guerrilla or revolutionary movement in some area. So we know that this happened, but it didn't prevent this dialogue. How come have we been led into a situation as of today where we don't even dare to talk to each other? There's something that beyond my understanding, because the situation was to some extent much worse 50 years ago than it is today. But we managed to talk at that time. Today we cannot. That means that beyond the geopolitical facts and geopolitical relations, there is something more. And this something more is probably in the psychology, the professionalism, the intellectual capabilities also of the leadership that we have, especially in the West. Because here also we see a distinct difference between the leadership we have in countries such as Russia, China, Iran, we can mention, or India, for instance, in Asia at large, where the leadership is obviously much higher standard than in the West. where you have people like Kaya Kalas, these people who don't understand, who are not even able to manage problem in their own country, who are obsessed with Russia, China, whoever. And once you try to argue or try to oppose or let's say challenge the decision or the leadership, then you're automatically qualified as a terrorist, and that happens in France, in UK. When you start demonstrating for Palestine, then you are considered a terrorist. This is something that we never had in Europe before. I mean, people demonstrated for the Palestinian, and in particular when the Palestinians were, in fact, demonstrably terrorists in the 60s or 70s. You had demonstrations in Western Europe for them. I mean, demonstrators were not considered as terrorists. I mean, you had the repression and you had all that, as you have today. It was didn't change much, but at that time, people were not charged with support to terrorism or things like this. Today, if you say that Iran is right or whatever, then you can be charged as sponsoring terrorism. Or, this is totally beyond any rational. And that 50 years ago, it was not like this. You could demonstrate. I mean, at the time, Iran was definitely. I mean, you had the Shah, which was officially, at least on the Western side, but you had a lot of demonstrations of people who were against the regime of the Shah. They were not even considered as terrorists. You see, demonstrations were. I mean, yeah, okay, that was that happened, and that was tolerated. I mean, within the framework of the law. But you were not charged as a support of terrorism when you were demonstrating against the Shah of Iran, for instance. So we have a situation in the West that has a mental posture that has radically changed, and I think it plays a role in the way we try or don't try to solve the problem. To some extent, I feel that especially on the European side, for the US, there are other issues at stake because obviously Trump wants to struggle or fight China, and therefore he doesn't want to get disturbed by other conflicts and things like this. So this is the situation of the US. But in Europe, you see that there is no interest, basically, in supporting a conflict and having a conflictual situation. For none of this conflict. I mean, certainly not Palestine, certainly not with Iran, and even with Russia. There is no rationale to support a conflict with Russia. You can or cannot like Vladimir Putin. That's up to each. But why do we need to support an armed conflict? I mean, this is to the detriment, certainly, of Ukraine. That's no question about that. But this is also to the detriment of Europe. So we are even working against our own interests. So that's why I said we are beyond geopolitics. We are definitely entering the world of psychiatry. And that should be a source of concern, by the way, because we talk about elections coming in France or whoever, but we don't see any leadership that could emerge from the society we know that could change the situation. I feel that those who may become president in France or elsewhere, they're even worse than their predecessors. And if you look at just the example of UK, I mean, after Boris Johnson, we were from bad to worse.
Yeah.
And look at Liz
Germany.
Truss. That
Germany.
was, sorry? And
Germany.
Germany. And Germany as well, yes. That,
Obvious.
that goes from bad to worse. And with what worries me is that Liz Truss was a poster example of that. But this such an intellectual weakness to lead a country such as UK is amazing. How come can somebody so stupid even come to the position of being a candidate for the position of prime minister? I mean, how come can you have people like Kaya Kallas or even Ursula von der Leyen? Because they have a record of failure. They have records of corruption, of lies. They have the poorest record you can have. How come can they come to the position of being even a candidate for a position in the European Union and things like this? This is that those people should have disappeared from a public life since years, because they have demonstrated their incapacity, their incapability of leading or managing situations. They are institutional stupid. You know, this is amazing. And what will come next is apparently not better. I mean, as long as we can anticipate who will come next, maybe we can be surprised by some miracle. But as of today, what we can see shows that we are going from disaster to disaster. And we are getting in even more complicated situations, because beyond complex situation on the ground, and the conflict or the solution of the conflict in Ukraine is obviously complex, even if the solution would have been very simple 3 years ago. Today it becomes more complex. But you have the same situation obviously in Palestine and with Iran. Again, had we continued with the JCPOA, things would have run smoothly, and everything would have been probably not completely solved, but at least we would have a more appeased situation today. But it's not what we have. We have worsened the situation all the time, and we are in more complex situation today than we were before, with people who are less intelligent than the ones who were dealing with the situation just 10 years ago. So we are with a leadership that is intellectually degraded and degrading steadily, with situation that gets more and more complex. So that's something that is, I mean, if you look a little bit, we try to anticipate situation. It's not very encouraging, I would say.
I think that they don't get evaluated by their expertise. They're evaluated by their level of hatred toward Russia, toward what's going on in Ukraine. I think that's why we have Kaya Kallas in that position. As you
Yes.
mentioned, you see no wisdom in these people, no policy. The only thing that they know how much they hate Russia, for whatever reason that would be.
I totally agree with you. This is probably the only quality, is that they hate Russia, and that's the. I mean, we don't. I mean, I cannot identify any other quality they may have, if hating Russia might be considered as a quality, by the way. But this is another debate. But they have demonstrated no ability to manage complex situations. And they have not, I mean, again, when you are in a position of leader, any That applies to a colonel as well as a politician. But very often, when it comes to managing conflicts with people or with situations, you have to go beyond your beliefs or your feelings very often. You have to put reason, rationale before your feelings. And that means that regardless of how you feel about this or this guy, you need to apply like rules, regulations, common sense, laws. I mean, there are some kind of framework condition that applies well before your feeling. The feeling must be the very last thing that you use in order to manage a situation. And here we have people who are seem to be driven by feeling. Decisions seem to be driven by feelings. And you can see that, again, I come from strategic intelligence, where obviously in strategic intelligence, you try to rationalize things because that's the purpose of strategic intelligence. And remember, we talked about this, about the issue of the Iranian nuclear bomb, alleged nuclear bomb. And when you have intelligence organization in your country, namely in the US, that say there is no nuclear weapons. I mean, the Iranians are not working on nuclear weapons. They have abandoned the idea in 2003. So then that's the basis for your rationale. You have people, experts, who know the country, who have their source of information, they have the analysts and all that, and they say, well, the nuclear bomb in Iran is not an issue. And then you have Trump, who said, I don't care what they say, I think they have a bomb, so then they have one. I mean, this is exactly where you see that the leadership here cannot be based on feelings. That's the reason why, by the way, you have an apparatus, you have intelligence, you have all that, because that's precisely to give a rationale to the decision making, to provide decision making with sound, vetted, assessed, evaluated information, to prevent people taking inspiration from the sky or whoever, and that's a reason why I say, even if a lot of people don't understand exactly the work of intelligence services, but I said that strategic intelligence is an important part of the rule of law, because that should provide the leadership with rational decision making. That should provide objective, factual element for decision making. And that should make, and when you talk about the 17th century in France, when you said the century of the Enlightenment means that the decision is enlightened. Enlightened means that the decision is rational, is no longer something inspired by God.
Yeah.
It's a decision that comes out of a factual analysis of the situation, a factual analysis of your national interest, a factual analysis of the interest of the population. And that should make your decision making then to the benefit of the country, to the benefit of the population, to the benefit of the people who elected you. And that's the reason why intelligence, and I speak especially of strategic intelligence, Strategic intelligence is an important, if not an essential part of this rule of law, where your decision making is based on facts, not on feelings. But why? Because our current leaders are so weak intellectually, they tend to not understand the need of having this intelligence, let's say, assessment, if you want to base the decision. They make their decision out of the guts, if you want. So we are talking about feelings-based decision making.
Yeah, exactly.
And I recently, you had in France, for instance, the head of the equivalent of the chief of the Joint Chief of Staff, or the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff in France, which is the Chef d'État-Major des Armées, who explained that France is now the main target or a defined target of Russia. Where does he get that from? I mean, nobody has ever said that. I've never heard that. Never, And why should France be the primary target of Russia? This doesn't make any sense. Meaning that those guys, and when I say those guys, I mean military people, who are supposed to be those who make the decision based on what they see on the ground. Because at the end of the day, you fight the enemy you can identify. I mean, you don't fight if you have nothing in front of you. So you need to have a very good reconnaissance and knowledge of what is in front of you. This guy is just inventing out of the blue a threat, and he is in fact planning the development of a French army based on an imaginary threat. I don't understand.
It's unbelievable. Actually, we got to the point that we cannot understand anymore what's going on with them. I think.
We agree on that.
Thank you so much, Colonel, for being with us today. Great pleasure as always. And I wanted to let you know that last week everybody was asking me, where is Colonel? Where is he? Why don't you have him? Yeah. But after all, thank you so much for being with us.
Okay, nice to be back, and thank you very much for inviting me. And I'm back to for everybody. Happy to be back again.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.